What would you risk to save a life the world says you have no right to touch? St. Catherine's private hospital had never seen panic like this. 20 of the world's most decorated physicians swarmed the pediatric wing decorated with twinkling lights and holly. Their designer scrubs moved in frantic choreography beneath chandeliers that cost more than surgery itself. Monitors shrieked. Ventilators gasped. A cardiac team from Massachusetts General shouted contradicting orders at neurosurgeons flown in from Zurich, while a Nobel-nominated immunologist pressed trembling fingers to his temples and whispered the words that froze every millionaire heart in the room. "We're losing him." Before we dive right in, hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and comment where you're watching from, whether you're in Australia, Canada, the United States, Africa, the UK, or anywhere across Europe. I want to see how far this story of unexpected twist can reach. I bring you powerful, heartfelt, and humanity-challenging stories every single day. And trust me, you don't want to miss tomorrow's story. But right now, let me take you inside that St. Catherine's Hospital where baby Alan Corey, heir to a $40 billion pharmaceutical empire, was dying. And $75,000 an hour in medical genius couldn't explain why his tiny fingers had turned the color of storm clouds, why his breathing came in shallow rattles, why every organ system was shutting down like dominoes falling in slow motion. Every scan came back normal. Every treatment accelerated his decline. And through the observation window, hands pressed against glass that had never been touched by someone like him, stood Joshua, 13 years old, son of no one, wearing a jacket held together with duct tape and shoes he'd found behind a dumpster 2 winters ago. He'd spent his entire life being invisible in this city, the boy who slept in condemned buildings, who ate what others threw away, who learned to notice everything because survival depended on what the comfortable world overlooked. Right now, he was staring at the decorated water dispenser near the infant's incubator. The one installed 3 days ago for the Christmas festivities. The one that had left a strange iridescent film on the nurse's hands. Hands that had bathed the baby. Hands that had touched his bottles, his blankets, his skin. The one every genius in that room had used 17 times without a second thought. Joshua's hands trembled. He knew what it was. His grandmother, who'd kept half the homeless shelters running with nothing but street wisdom and faith, had taught him to recognize chemical poisoning before he learned to write. Ornamental water treatment. Festive toxins. Silent killer. The doctors were preparing emergency surgery, searching for genetic disorders. The answer was sitting in a sparkling dispenser wrapped in garland. Joshua looked at the security guard pacing the hall, then at the "No unauthorized person" sign, then at his own reflection, ragged, black, unwanted. He thought about what would happen if he was wrong. Then he thought about what would happen if he was right and stayed silent. Joshua pulled his jacket tight, whispered a prayer his grandmother taught him, and moved. The first scream came at 11:47 p.m. on Christmas Eve. John Corey had been standing in the nursery, watching his infant son sleep beneath a mobile of golden stars, when Alan's tiny body seized. Not the gentle startle reflex of newborns, but something violent and wrong. The baby's back arched. His eyes rolled white. A sound came from his throat that no 6-month-old should make. John's wife, Margaret, lunged for the emergency call button. Her diamond bracelet caught the Christmas lights as her hands slammed the wall panel again and again. Within 90 seconds, St. Catherine's night staff flooded the room. Within 5 minutes, the hospital's chief of pediatrics was running down the hallway in house slippers, his phone pressed to his ear, barking names of specialists to summon immediately. Alan's lips had turned the color of a winter bruise. His breathing came in gasps that sounded like drowning on dry land. Every breath seemed to cost him something he didn't have left to give. The on-call physician, a woman who'd delivered 3,000 babies without losing one, placed her stethoscope against the infant's chest and heard rhythms that made her blood run cold. His heart was racing and failing simultaneously. His lungs filled with fluid that shouldn't exist. "Get me a crash cart," she said, her voice steady despite the terror climbing her spine. "And someone call Boston." Get Dr. Chin on a plane now. Margaret Corey collapsed into her husband's arms, her Christmas Eve gown crumpling like paper. John held her with one hand and gripped his phone with the other, his thumb scrolling through contacts most people would need security clearance to access. Surgeons. Specialists. People who didn't take calls at midnight unless your last name opened doors that money alone couldn't. By 12:15 a.m., the nursery had transformed into a war room. Dr. Raymond Hess from Johns Hopkins arrived first, his tie still knotted from a charity gala. Dr. Amara Okonkwo from London's Royal Children's Hospital landed 20 minutes later, her team wheeling in equipment that cost more than most houses. A toxicologist from Geneva. A genetic specialist from Stanford. A cardiac surgeon who'd once operated on a sheik's grandson mid-flight at 30,000 feet. 20 physicians. For continence. One dying heir. They worked with the precision of people who'd spent decades mastering the impossible. Blood samples vanished into machines that hummed with purpose. Scans painted Alan's small body in blues and whites across screens that crowded every surface. Hands moved with practiced grace, inserting lines, adjusting monitors, consulting in medical terminology that sounded like incantation. Outside, snow began to fall over the city. Church bells rang midnight. And inside St. Catherine's most expensive wing, surrounded by medicine's finest minds and machinery that could see inside atoms, baby Alan Corey stopped breathing. The machine screamed. And 20 geniuses realized they had no answers. Joshua had learned to be a ghost by the time he was 7 years old. It wasn't something anyone taught him. It was something the streets demanded. When you slept in the skeletal remains of abandoned row houses, when you ate from dumpsters behind restaurants that threw away more food than you'd see in a week, when your skin color made people clutch their purses tighter and cross to the other side of the street, you learned quickly that survival meant disappearing. You learned to walk without sound, to breathe without taking up space, to move through the world as if you weren't really there at all. Tonight, he'd slipped into St. Catherine's through the service entrance behind the loading dock. The lock had been broken for 3 weeks. Joshua knew because he'd been sleeping in the hospital's basement storage room when the winter nights got too cold to survive outside. The security guards never checked that corridor. The cleaning staff worked around his carefully hidden bedroll without ever seeing it. Invisible. He'd come upstairs for water from the staff break room sink when he heard the commotion. Now he stood in the observation alcove adjacent to the pediatric wing, partially hidden behind a supply cart someone had abandoned during the crisis. His torn jacket hung loose over a shirt he'd been wearing for 6 days. His shoes, 2 sizes too big and mismatched, made no sound on the polished floor. His hands gripped the cart's metal edge as he watched through the interior window. 20 doctors moved like a symphony of panic. Their faces were masks of controlled desperation. The kind of expression Joshua recognized from people who'd built their entire lives on being the smartest person in the room, only to discover that intelligence had limits. That money had limits. That expertise could fail. The baby on the table was dying. Joshua could see it in the slowing rhythm of the monitors, in the way the doctor's movements became more frantic and less purposeful, in how the woman in the expensive dress had stopped crying and started praying instead. When people stopped crying and started praying, it meant they'd accepted what was coming. His grandmother had taught him that. She taught him other things too. How to read a fever by touch. How to recognize poison in water, in food, in the very air. How to see what people missed because they were looking with degrees instead of instinct. Joshua's eyes moved across the room, cataloging everything. The machines. The medications lined up like toy soldiers. The frantic consultation between specialists. The father pacing like a caged animal. The Christmas decorations that seemed obscene against the backdrop of death. And then his gaze stopped. Near the infant's incubator, installed against the wall where the nurses filled bottles and warmed blankets, stood the festive water dispenser. Decorated with candy cane stripes and a cheerful sign, "Pure Holiday Hydration, courtesy of Lux Medical Solutions." The water inside had a faint shimmer. almost imperceptible. The kind of thing you'd only notice if you'd lived your whole life watching for danger in places others saw only convenience. Joshua's grandmother's voice echoed in his memory, sharp and clear as the day she'd grabbed his wrist and pulled him away from a public fountain. "Baby, when water shines like that, it ain't water anymore. It's death wearing a smile." His heart stopped. Then started again, pounding against his ribs like fists on a locked door. Dr. Raymond Hess had performed over 3,000 pediatric surgeries in his career. He'd separated conjoined twins. He'd reconstructed hearts that looked like abstract art. He'd brought children back from the edge of death so many times that medical journals had entire sections dedicated to his techniques. Right now, staring at baby Alan Corey's declining vitals, he felt like a first-year resident who just realized he'd chosen the wrong profession. "Run the metabolic panel again," he barked at the lab technician. "And get me a complete toxicology screen. Everything. Street drugs, prescription medications, environmental contaminants, everything." Dr. Amara Okonkwo was already 2 steps ahead, her fingers flying across a tablet as she pulled up genetic markers. "Metabolic panel is clean. 3rd time. No anomalies in liver function, kidney function, pancreatic enzymes." The toxicology came back negative for over 200 compounds. She looked up, her expression carved from frustration. "Raymond, this child is dying from nothing. Every test says he should be fine." "Then run different tests." John Corey's voice cut through the room like a blade. He stood against the wall, his $2,000 suit wrinkled, his face aged a decade in 2 hours. "You're telling me I flew in the best medical minds on the planet and nobody can tell me what's killing my son?" The cardiac surgeon from Stanford, Dr. Michael Torres, was adjusting the ventilator settings for the 4th time. "Mr. Corey, we understand your frustration, but medicine isn't magic. Without identifying the pathogen or toxin or defect, we're essentially treating shadows." "Then find the damn light," John hissed. The room descended into controlled chaos again. A neurologist from Boston examined brain scans that showed no abnormalities. A pulmonologist from Switzerland listened to lung sounds that defied explanation. The Nobel-nominated immunologist drew blood samples with hands that had stopped steady an hour ago. Dr. Hess pulled up a digital conference with specialists in Tokyo and Mumbai, projecting Alan's scans onto the wall-mounted screens. 15 more of the world's finest physicians studied the data in real time, their faces pixelated but their confusion universal. "Propose sepsis protocol," suggested the doctor from Mumbai. "Already administered." No response, Dr. Okonkwo replied. "What about an autoimmune response? Something triggered?" Tested for 73 autoimmune markers. All negative. Environmental allergen? Something in the room? Air quality analyzed. Within normal parameters. Margaret Corey watched from the corner, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. She'd stopped asking questions. Stopped demanding answers. She simply stared at her son's small body surrounded by machines and minds that should have been enough. Should have been. The clock above the door ticked toward 1:30 a.m. Baby Alan's oxygen saturation dropped another point. Then another. The buffer between life and death narrowing with each passing minute. Dr. Hess stepped back from the incubator, removing his gloves with movements that felt like defeat. He looked at his colleagues, 20 of the most brilliant physicians he'd ever worked alongside, and saw his own helplessness reflected in their faces. They had degrees from institutions most people only saw in movies. They had published research that had saved thousands of lives. They had technology that could map the human genome and see individual cells dividing. And they couldn't save one baby. "Prepare for emergency surgical intervention," Dr. Hess finally said, his voice hollow. "If we can't diagnose it, we'll have to explore manually. Open him up and see what we're missing." It was a desperate measure. The kind of thing you did when science failed and prayer seemed more reliable than medicine. In the observation alcove, hidden behind the supply cart, Joshua watched them prepare for surgery. and knew they were about to kill the child they were trying to save. Joshua's grandmother used to say that rich people were blind in a very specific way. Not blind to color or beauty or the price tags on things they'd never think twice about buying. Blind to consequence. Blind to the small details that survival taught you to see. They look at a thing and see what it's supposed to be, she told him once, her weathered hands sorting through donated medications behind the homeless shelter. We look at a thing and see what it could do to us. Joshua was looking at the water dispenser the way his grandmother had taught him. Not as decoration. Not as convenience. As threat. The dispenser was new, installed sometime in the last 72 hours based on the pristine condition of the candy cane decals. Lux Medical Solutions, a name he didn't recognize, but then again he wouldn't. Companies that serviced places like St. Catherine's didn't advertise in the neighborhoods where Joshua slept. The water inside had that shimmer. That iridescent quality that caught light like oil on pavement after rain. He watched a nurse approach the dispenser, fill a small bottle, carry it to the warming station near Alan's incubator. Watched her test the temperature against her wrist. Watched her prepare to add it to the infant's 4 nutrition line. Joshua's stomach dropped. His grandmother's voice again, sharper this time, the tone she'd used when she caught him reaching for a discarded energy drink behind a gas station. Baby, listen to me. When they make water look pretty, when they add things to make it shine or smell sweet or feel smooth, they're putting in chemicals. And chemicals don't care if you're rich or poor. They just do what they're made to do. She'd shown him examples. Decorative fountain water treated with algae seeds that burn skin. Holiday displays with water mixed with antifreeze for winter resilience. Ornamental features in luxury buildings where the water looked crystal clear but contained compounds that would shut down a kidney in hours. The fancy places are the worst, she'd said, because they trust the name on the label more than they trust their own eyes. Joshua's gaze moved from the dispenser to the baby. Back to the dispenser. To the nurses who'd been using it all shift. To the bottles lined up on the counter, each one filled with that shimmering, supposedly pure water. How many times had they bathed Alan with it? How many bottles had been mixed using it? How much had been absorbed through his delicate skin? His underdeveloped system filtering poison that looked like hydration. The doctors were running tests for exotic diseases. Genetic disorders. Rare toxins that required million-dollar equipment to detect. They weren't testing the water. Why would they? It came from a medical supply company. It had certifications. It had a cheerful label and a professional installation. It was supposed to be there. Joshua pressed his forehead against the cool metal of the supply cart. His mind raced through everything his grandmother had taught him. The symptoms matched. The blue-tinged skin. The respiratory distress. The organ systems shutting down one by one. It was textbook chemical poisoning, the kind that happened when someone trusted a label more than they trusted reality. The surgeons were about to cut that baby open. They'd find nothing. And by the time they realized their mistake, if they ever did, Alan Corey would be dead on an operating table, killed by water that sparkled like Christmas magic. Joshua looked down at his hands. Dirty. Scarred. The hands of a boy who'd never held anything valuable in his life. He looked through the window at the 20 brilliant doctors preparing their instruments. Then he looked at the security guard standing between him and that room. His grandmother had taught him one more thing. One final lesson before the pneumonia took her, before Joshua became truly alone in the world. Sometimes, baby, you got to decide what you're willing to lose. Your safety, your silence, your place in a world that don't want you anyway. And sometimes the only thing worth losing everything for is the chance to save one life that nobody else can see needs saving. Joshua pushed away from the supply cart. His legs felt like water. His heart felt like thunder. He started walking toward the door. The alarm screamed first. Not the steady beep of monitoring equipment, but the urgent, piercing shriek that meant a body was giving up. Every head in the pediatric wing snapped toward the incubator. Every hand reached for something, anything, to reverse what was happening. Baby Alan's oxygen saturation plummeted. 90%. 85. 78. Numbers that should descend slowly over hours were dropping like stones in water. He's crashing. Dr. Okonkwo's voice cut through the chaos with surgical precision. Get me epinephrine. Now. Hands moved in practice synchronization. A nurse tore open the crash cart. Another adjusted the ventilator to maximum support. Dr. Torres positioned himself at the head of the incubator, his fingers checking for a pulse that was becoming harder to find. Margaret Corey's scream was raw and primal, a sound that belonged to mothers throughout history who'd watched their children slip away despite every prayer, every bargain with God, every promise to trade places if only fate would listen. John caught her before she could reach the incubator. Security moved to create a barrier between the parents and the medical team. Not cruelty. Protocol. The doctors needed space to work without interference, needed to focus on medicine instead of grief. Clear, Dr. Hess said, his voice steady despite the sweat on his forehead. The defibrillator charged. That high-pitched whine that sounded like a question. Alan's tiny body jerked as electricity coursed through him. Twice. 3 times. The monitor flatlined. Then stuttered. Then showed a rhythm so weak it looked like a plea instead of a heartbeat. Again, Dr. Hess commanded. Outside the windows, the city held its breath. Snow fell in thick curtains, muffling the sounds of a world that kept turning despite the tragedy unfolding in one of its most expensive rooms. Church bells had finished their midnight chorus. Christmas Day had arrived. Somewhere, children were waking up to presents under trees. Somewhere, families were laughing over hot chocolate and poorly wrapped gifts. In St. Catherine's pediatric wing, a family was watching their only son die. Rhythms not stabilizing, Dr. Torres said, his hand still on Alan's tiny wrist. We're losing him. The words hung in the air like an execution. Dr. Hess looked at his colleagues, at the parents, at the machines that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. He looked at 20 years of medical school, 30 years of practice, thousands of successful procedures. He looked at everything he knew, everything he'd learned, every life he'd saved. None of it mattered. Time of death, he started to say. And that's when Joshua burst through the door. Not walked. Not entered quietly. His shoulder hit the door with enough force to slam it against the wall. His mismatched shoes squeaked on the polished floor. His torn jacket flapped around his thin frame like wings. Every face turned toward him. The ragged black boy in clothes held together with hope and duct tape. The child who had no business being in this wing, this hospital, this moment. Security guard Marcus Johnson moved first, his hand already reaching for Joshua's arm. Kid, you can't be in here. This is a restricted. The water, Joshua gasped, his voice cracking with desperation and certainty. It's the water. You're poisoning him with the water. Dr. Hess blinked. What? The dispenser. Joshua pointed with a shaking hand toward the candy cane-striped unit against the wall. It's contaminated. Chemical treatment. Ornamental grade. You've been bathing him in poison. Feeding him poison. It's in his system. In his skin. In everything you've touched. 20 pairs of eyes stared at him. Then at the water dispenser. Then back at the dying baby. And in that moment of silence, in that space between disbelief and desperate hope, the machines measuring Alan Corey's life showed numbers dropping toward 0. Someone had to decide. Believe a boy who looked like he'd crawled out of a dumpster. Or trust the protocol that had failed for 3 hours straight. Dr. Okonkwo moved first. Get me activated charcoal, she snapped. And flush his 4 lines with clean saline. Now. Wait. Dr. Hess raised his hand, his voice carrying the weight of authority that had commanded operating rooms for 3 decades. Dr. Okonkwo, stop. She froze, syringe in hand. We're not making medical decisions based on some homeless kid who broke into a restricted area, Dr. Hess continued, his eyes moving from Joshua to the security guard. Marcus, remove him. Immediately. But the water, Joshua started. The water has been tested, Dr. Torres interrupted, his tone sharp with exhaustion and frustration. Every environmental factor in this room has been analyzed. The air, the surfaces, the equipment, everything meets hospital standards. You didn't test the dispenser, Joshua insisted, his voice rising. You tested the air and the surfaces, but you didn't test what you've been putting directly into his body. Son, John Corey stepped forward, his face a mask of barely controlled rage. My child is dying. These doctors have more education in their little fingers than you'll see in your entire life. And you have the audacity to burst in here with some conspiracy theory about water? Marcus's hand clamped down on Joshua's shoulder. The kind of grip that meant this conversation was over. No, please, Joshua struggled against the hold. I know what I saw. My grandmother, she taught me, there's a shimmer in the water, it means chemicals, ornamental treatment grade, it's not safe for. Your grandmother, Dr. Hess said the words like they tasted bitter, is not a medical professional. I don't care what folk remedies or street wisdom you think you learned. This child needs actual medicine, not superstition. Get him out of here, John Corey's voice was ice. Before I have you arrested for trespassing and harassment. Marcus pulled Joshua toward the door. The boy's mismatched shoes scraped against the floor as he tried to plant his feet, tried to make them understand. Please, just look at it, Joshua's voice cracked. Just test the water. It'll take 5 minutes. 5 minutes and you'll see I'm right. Please. The only thing I see, Margaret Corey spoke for the first time since her scream, her voice hollow with grief, is a disturbed child interrupting doctors who are trying to save my baby. How dare you? How dare you come in here and… Her voice broke. John pulled her close. And Joshua felt Marcus's grip tighten, lifting him almost off his feet as they moved toward the exit. You're making a mistake, Joshua said, quieter now, the fight draining out of him as reality settled in. Nobody was listening. Nobody ever listened. He was just another invisible kid with a voice that didn't matter. He's going to die if you don't. Enough, Dr. Hess turned back to the incubator, dismissing Joshua completely. We've wasted enough time. Prep for surgical intervention. We're going in. The team returned to their positions. Instruments gleamed under the lights. Hands scrubbed. Masks adjusted. The machinery of modern medicine whirring back to life, confident and certain and completely wrong. Joshua watched through the door as Marcus dragged him into the hallway. Watched them prepare to cut open a baby to find answers that weren't inside his body. Watched the nurse fill another bottle from the contaminated dispenser. Watched Dr. Okonkwo use that water to rinse her hands before returning to the sterile field. The door swung shut. And Joshua stood in the hallway, trembling, watching through the window as they moved Alan toward the operating table. His grandmother's voice echoed one more time. Sometimes, baby, the world won't listen until you make them see. Marcus's hand was still on his shoulder, ready to escort him out of the building, out of this moment, back to the streets where boys like him belonged. Joshua had two choices. Walk away. Stay invisible. Let them be wrong on their own. Or force them to see what they refused to believe. His hands curled into fists. And he made his decision. Joshua twisted out of Marcus's grip with a movement born from years of evading people who wanted to remove him from places he wasn't supposed to be. The security guard grabbed for him, caught only air and torn fabric as Joshua's jacket sleeve ripped free. Kid, don't. But Joshua was already moving. Not toward the exit. Toward the room. He hit the door at full speed, his shoulder slamming the handle down, his momentum carrying him through before anyone could react. Marcus shouted behind him. Alarms would follow. More security. Police, probably. Joshua didn't care. He had maybe 30 seconds before they dragged him out permanently. 30 seconds to save a life or prove himself a fool. The surgical team looked up in shock as Joshua raced past them, not toward the baby, but toward the water dispenser. His hands reached for it, trembling with adrenaline and terror and absolute certainty. Security! John Corey roared. Stop him! Dr. Hess moved to intercept, but Joshua was smaller, faster, driven by desperation that made him reckless. Joshua grabbed the dispenser's spigot, twisted it open. Water, that shimmering, deadly water, poured onto the floor. Then he grabbed one of the filled bottles from the counter, the one they'd been about to use for Alan's next four-flush. Watch, Joshua said, his voice shaking but loud. Just watch. He poured the water into the stainless steel sink. The overhead surgical lights caught it perfectly. That iridescent shimmer spread across the metal surface like oil, like a rainbow, like proof. That's not normal, Joshua gasped as Marcus and another guard entered the room. Water doesn't do that. Not drinking water. Not medical water. That's chemical treatment. Ornamental grade. The kind they use in decorative fountains and holiday displays where people aren't supposed to touch it, let alone bathe babies in it. Dr. Okonkwo moved closer to the sink. Her eyes narrowed. Her hand reached out, not touching the water but hovering above it, studying the way light refracted through the liquid in patterns that didn't belong. He's right, she said quietly. That's not water. That's... Jesus Christ, that's... Get that boy out of here before I call the police, John Corey snarled, but there was something different in his voice now. A hesitation. Joshua didn't wait for permission. He grabbed another bottle, this one already opened, the one the nurse had been using to rinse instruments. He held it up to the light. Look at your hands, Joshua said directly to Dr. Okonkwo. You just washed with this. Look. She raised her hands. Under the harsh surgical lights, her skin had a faint oily residue. The kind that didn't belong on hands that were supposed to be sterile. Dr. Torres moved to the dispenser, his face transforming from anger to horrified understanding. He examined the label more closely, his fingers finding text so small it required reading glasses to decipher. For ornamental medical facility displays only, he read aloud, his voice dropping to a whisper. Not for human consumption or contact. Contains polyquaternium compounds, antimicrobial agents, and, his voice stopped. And ethylene glycol derivatives. The room went silent. Ethylene glycol. Antifreeze. Poison. How much has he been exposed to? Dr. Hess asked, but it wasn't really a question. It was the sound of reality crashing down on 3 decades of certainty. All of it, the nurse said, her face draining of color. We used it for everything. His bottles. His baths. The compresses on his skin. The equipment rinses. Everything. Margaret Corey made a sound that had no name. Horror and relief and rage twisted together. How did you know? Dr. Okonkwo turned to Joshua, but Marcus's hands were already on the boy again, pulling him back. My grandmother, Joshua said simply. She taught me what to look for. Because people like us, we don't get second chances if we drink the wrong water. We have to know. John Corey's face had gone from red to gray. Let him go. Sir? I said let him go. John's voice was hoarse. That boy he just... Marcus released Joshua's arms. The boy stood there, trembling, water still dripping from his hands onto the floor, surrounded by 20 of the world's most brilliant doctors who'd missed what he'd seen immediately. Activated charcoal, Dr. Okonkwo snapped, the paralysis breaking. Sodium bicarbonate. Fomepizole if we have it. We need to flush his system completely. Use distilled water only, sealed bottles. Nothing from that dispenser. Now. The team exploded into action. Real action this time. Targeted. Purposeful. Fighting an enemy they could finally name. Alan's monitors were still screaming. His tiny body still shutting down. But now they knew what they were fighting. And Joshua, the ragged boy in mismatched shoes who'd forced them to see what expertise had blinded them to, stood in the center of the room. Visible at last. You, John Corey said, his voice breaking. What's your name? Joshua's throat was so tight he could barely speak. Joshua, sir. Joshua. John repeated it like a prayer. like a debt he'd never be able to repay. "Sit, please. Stay." So Joshua stayed and watched as medicine finally fought the right enemy. The next 40 minutes existed outside of time. Dr. Okonkwo worked with the focused intensity of someone who knew they were racing death and winning by inches. Her hands moved with precision as she flushed Alan's 4 lines with sealed distilled water, replacing every drop of contaminated fluid with clean saline that hadn't touched the poison dispenser. "Activated charcoal going in," a nurse announced, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. The black liquid looked wrong, flowing into something so small and fragile, but it was binding to the toxins, pulling them from Alan's system before they could do more damage. Dr. Torres monitored the cardiac rhythms, watching numbers that had been plummeting begin to stabilize. Slowly, painfully slowly, but stabilizing. "Oxygen saturation climbing," he said, not quite allowing hope into his voice yet. 82, 85, 87. Joshua stood against the wall where John Corey had positioned him, as far from the medical action as possible but still in the room. His legs felt weak. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. He'd done what his grandmother taught him, but the outcome still hung in the balance between intervention and too late. Margaret Corey knelt beside the incubator, her hands pressed against the clear plastic, whispering prayers in a voice so quiet it was almost just breath. Joshua recognized the words. His grandmother had said the same ones over dying men in homeless shelters, over sick children in abandoned buildings, over anyone who needed God's attention more than they needed human answers. Dr. Hess stood at the monitoring station, his face carved from stone and regret. He'd ordered Joshua removed. He'd dismissed the warning. He'd been ready to cut open a baby to find poison that was never inside the child's body. The weight of that near catastrophe showed in every line of his face. "Fomepizole administered," Dr. Okonkwo said, injecting the antidote for ethylene glycol poisoning. "If we caught it in time, this should block the toxic metabolites before they cause permanent kidney or brain damage." That terrible word hung in the air. The machines beeped steadily. The ventilator hissed its mechanical rhythm. Outside the windows, dawn was beginning to break over the city, painting the snow-covered streets in shades of pink and gold. Christmas morning. The day of miracles, whether you believed in them or not. "Heart rate normalizing," Dr. Torres said, and this time there was something in his voice that hadn't been there before. Fragile and cautious, but real. Respiratory effort improving. Peripheral circulation returning. Core temperature rising. The updates came in steady succession, each one a small victory, each one pushing Alan Corey further from the edge of death he'd been teetering on for hours. And then, in the silence between one breath and the next, baby Alan opened his eyes. Margaret's sob was joy and relief and every emotion that couldn't fit into words. John's hand found his wife's shoulder, his grip so tight his knuckles went white. "Hello there," Dr. Okonkwo whispered to the baby, her professional composure cracking just slightly. "Welcome back." Alan's tiny fingers curled and uncurled. His chest rose and fell with breaths that looked almost normal. The blue tinge that had colored his skin was fading, replaced by the healthy pink that belonged on a 6-month-old child. "He's going to make it," Dr. Hess said, and the words sounded like confession and absolution all at once. "He's actually going to make it." The surgical team stood in stunned silence. 20 brilliant minds who'd exhausted every protocol, every test, every procedure in their arsenal. 20 experts who'd been 30 seconds from exploratory surgery that would have found nothing and wasted the last minutes of a dying child's life. Saved by a homeless boy who'd learned medicine from his grandmother behind shelters and in abandoned buildings. Dr. Okonkwo turned to Joshua. Her eyes were bright with tears she wouldn't let fall, not here, not now, but they were there nonetheless. "You saved his life," she said simply. "When everything we knew failed, you saw what we couldn't. How do we—" She stopped because how did you thank someone for that? What words existed? Joshua's face was on television. His story was being told by people who'd never met him, never known he existed until this moment. The world that had worked so hard to make him invisible suddenly couldn't look away. And in the pediatric wing of St. Catherine's Hospital, baby Alan Corey slept peacefully in his father's arms, alive because wisdom sometimes comes from the places power never thinks to look. Justice was beginning, but mercy had already arrived. On Christmas morning, in the form of a boy in mismatched shoes who refused to stay silent when silence meant death. 3 months later, Joshua stood in front of a mirror that actually belonged to him. The apartment was small but warm. 2 bedrooms in a building where the heat worked and the locks held. John Corey had insisted. Not charity, he'd said. A debt that could never be fully repaid. Joshua touched the reflection, still not quite believing it was real. Clean clothes that fit. Shoes that matched. A bed he didn't have to hide. Food in a refrigerator that had his name on the lease. But more than that, he was enrolled in school. Real school with books and teachers who knew his name. The Coreys had established a scholarship in his grandmother's name, funding education for children the system overlooked. Dr. Okonkwo had offered him a mentorship. Your grandmother was a healer, she'd said. Maybe you are too. Maybe he was. Joshua picked up the framed photograph on his dresser. His grandmother, young and smiling, before the streets had worn her down. Before she'd spent her life saving people who couldn't afford to be saved by anyone else. I didn't stay silent, he whispered to her image. Just like you taught me. Outside his window, the city moved forward. Somewhere, baby Alan Corey was learning to walk. Somewhere, Richard Strathmore sat in a cell awaiting trial. Somewhere, hospitals were changing protocols because a boy in torn clothes had forced them to see. Joshua was no longer invisible. And he never would be again. 20 genius doctors couldn't solve it. A homeless 13-year-old did. Result? 1 dying baby saved. 4 hospitals protected. 1 billionaire brought to his knees in gratitude. A murderer exposed. All in one Christmas night. The craziest part? This almost didn't happen because nobody wanted to listen to a kid in torn clothes. Makes you wonder who you're not listening to right now. Subscribe so you never miss stories this powerful, and share this because someone in your life needs to hear that their voice could change everything, even when the whole world says it doesn't matter. See you in the next video. Cheers.